On February 28, 2026, the one thing that so many had feared for so long finally happened. A regional conflict that had been simmering for decades between Iran, Israel, and the United States didn't just escalate, it absolutely exploded. And in an instant, it became a global crisis that touched every single corner of the world.
So, let's break down how this all went down. First, we're going to rewind the clock and look at the decades of tension that built this thing up piece by piece. Then, we'll get right into the first explosive days of the war itself. After that, we're going to follow the economic shockwaves that literally rocked the globe in a matter of hours. And finally, we'll land where we are today, trying to make sense of the incredibly fragile and high-stakes standoff the world is now stuck in.
You know, to really get what happened in 2026, we have to go back, way back. This war didn't just start out of nowhere with the first missile launch. Nope. It's the final result of decades of hostility, sanctions, and shadow wars that basically created a giant tinderbox just waiting for a single spark.
When you look at this timeline, you can see this dangerous pattern building over time. It all really kicks off in the 1980s, during that absolutely brutal Iran-Iraq war. The US, worried about Iran's revolution spreading, backs Saddam Hussein in Iraq. This led to some direct clashes, including the incredibly tragic moment a US warship shot down an Iranian civilian airliner. For Iran's leaders, this was a searing lesson. They couldn't compete head-to-head. So they poured resources into two key areas, ballistic missiles and proxy forces like Hezbollah. Then you fast forward to 2002, and everything changes. The world discovers Iran's secret nuclear program, and a whole new, much more dangerous game begins. We see crippling sanctions meant to starve Iran's economy, alongside covert stuff, like cyber attacks and assassinations of scientists, all to slow the program down. The temperature skyrockets in 2020 when the US assassinates General Qasem Soleimani, the mastermind of Iran's entire regional strategy. That brought everyone right to the edge of a full-scale war. It was followed by a short, intense 12-day war in 2025, which saw the US directly hit Iranian nuclear sites. The final domino fell just a few months later, in early 2026. A violent crackdown on protests inside Iran prompted a massive American military buildup in the Gulf, setting the stage for the explosion that was to come.
So, if you strip away all the layers of proxy wars and politics, what you're left with is one fundamental clash. On one side, you have Iran's relentless drive for nuclear capability. Now, from their perspective, this isn't just about ego, it's about survival. They look at countries like Iraq and Libya who gave up weapons programs and then saw their leaders overthrown, and they believe a nuke is the only real insurance policy against a superpower. It's also about projecting power in the region. But on the other side, you have the United States and Israel, who are absolutely determined to stop that from happening no matter what. For them, a nuclear Iran would completely upend the balance of power, kick off a terrifying arms race in the Middle East, and put an apocalyptic weapon in the hands of a regime they see as fundamentally hostile. For decades, this one, single, seemingly unsolvable issue has been the engine driving this entire conflict.
Okay, so let's get to it. February 28, 2026. The day this whole thing finally boiled over. The attack was sudden, it was a shock, and it caught the world off guard, especially because it happened while diplomatic talks were supposedly still going on.
On that day, the US and Israel unleashed a huge coordinated air campaign. You had the American Operation Epic Fury and the Israeli one Roaring Lion, both designed to land a single devastating knockout punch right at the start.
And the scale here was just unbelievable. In the single largest combat mission in its entire history, the Israeli Air Force hit 500 different military targets all across Iran. They essentially overwhelmed the country's air defenses in just a few hours.
And the intensity, wow, Israel dropped over 1,200 bombs in just the first 24 hours. And at the same time, you have US jets flying in from bases and aircraft carriers all over the region, carrying out their own strikes on command centers, missile sites, and naval ships.
But this wasn't just about destroying hardware. A huge part of the plan was to literally decapitate the regime. It was a massive gamble. The thinking was that Iran's power structure was so centralized, so focused on one man, that if you could take out the head of the snake, the supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, along with other top officials, you'd create so much chaos and confusion that the whole state might just collapse from the inside. It was a high-risk, high-reward shot at winning the war before it could even get started. And to top it all off, this was paired with a massive cyber attack that basically took Iran's entire internet and other critical infrastructure offline.
But despite that massive opening blow, Iran's response was incredibly fast and furious. In just the first 10 days, they fired back with everything they had,
over 500 ballistic missiles, and 2,000 attack drones. It was a clear message. The decapitation strike hadn't worked. The regime's chain of command was still intact. And their targets weren't just in Israel. They hit U.S. bases and the countries of American allies across the Persian Gulf, immediately turning this into a massive region-wide conflict.
Now, the war's impact wasn't just limited to the battlefield. One of Iran's most powerful counterpunches wasn't a military one at all. It was economic, and it sent an immediate shockwave through the entire global financial system.
So to really get why this was so devastating, you have to understand this concept of a maritime choke point. Just think of all the shipping lanes around the world as the arteries and veins of the global economy. They carry the energy and goods that keep everything moving. A choke point is a really narrow passage in that system, and if you block it, it's like clamping shut one of the world's main arteries.
And of all the choke points in the world, the Strait of Hormuz is the big one. I mean, just look at these numbers. Before the war, a full quarter of the world's seaborne oil and a fifth of its natural gas had to pass through this one tiny little waterway. So, in retaliation for the airstrikes, Iran did the one thing the world had dreaded for decades. They shut it down.
This analogy really just nails it. Imagine every single delivery truck for your entire country, food, gas, everything, had to drive through one single-lane tunnel. And some hostile power had the on-off switch for that tunnel. It doesn't matter how big your economy is or how strong your army is, the person with their hand on that switch has incredible power. Well, that's the power Iran suddenly decided to use, turning a simple piece of geography into a devastating economic weapon.
And the effect was immediate, and it was brutal. Oil prices just exploded, going from about $95 a barrel to a peak of $126 in just a few weeks. And this wasn't just some number on a screen. This meant instant pain at the gas pump for people everywhere. Higher heating bills, it fueled inflation and hit the wallets of families and businesses all around the globe.
And believe me, it was so much bigger than just oil. The crisis just cascaded through the global supply chain in ways you'd never even think about. A lot of the world's fertilizer, for instance, comes from natural gas that passes through the strait. So, boom, food prices spike. We saw shortages of industrial materials. Helium? Why helium? Well, because it's a byproduct of natural gas processing in Qatar, which was now cut off. Suddenly, things like MRI machines are at risk. Big aluminum plants, which need tons of energy, started shutting down. Airlines canceled thousands of flights, and Europe was facing the very real possibility of running out of jet fuel in maybe 6 weeks. The closure of one little waterway had kicked off a massive systemic global crisis.
So, that brings us to today. After those first crazy weeks of fighting and economic chaos, the conflict moved into a new phase, one that's just as dangerous, a really fragile diplomatic standoff.
So, one of the key bets the US and Israel made, that killing the supreme leader would cause the whole Iranian government to just fall apart, well, it turned out to be wrong. The state was way more resilient than they thought. And you have to understand, while the supreme leader has the final say, Iran isn't a simple anarchy. There are institutions for this stuff, like the Assembly of Experts. In the chaos right after the assassination, they moved fast, took control, and then elected the late leader's son, Mojtaba Khamenei. It was a quick, stable transfer of power that really surprised a lot of people in the West.
With the world's economy on the ropes and the war threatening to get even bigger, Pakistan, which has decent relations with both sides, managed to step in and mediate. Their diplomats worked around the clock and secured a temporary ceasefire, which opened up this tiny but crucial window for direct talks in Islamabad.
And this right here, this is the heart of the problem. The gap between what the two sides want isn't just big, it's a canyon. The U.S. is demanding that Iran's nuclear program be completely, permanently, and verifiably taken apart. That's their absolute bottom line. Meanwhile, Iran is demanding not just that the world recognize its right to enrich uranium, but also a total lifting of all sanctions and a full U.S. military withdrawal from the Middle East. These aren't just negotiating points, they are completely opposite views on how the world should work.
And the public statements we're hearing from leaders are not exactly helping to calm things down. This quote from President Trump talking about a potential U.S. concession just shows you how far apart they really are and how quickly this whole thing could slide back into war. The level of distrust built up over 40 years is just immense.
So this is the strange and tense situation we're in right now. It's a kind of peace, but a fragile one. The ceasefire is holding, for now, but it's not normal. You have this bizarre, dual blockade. Iran is blocking ships from passing through the Strait of Hormuz, while the U.S. Navy has set up its own blockade of Iranian ports, stopping Iran from exporting its own oil or importing anything. It's a military standoff
with the entire global economy caught in the crossfire, paying the price every single day it continues.
All right, so to quickly recap the big points here, we've seen how decades of bad blood created the perfect setup for this war. We saw it kick off with a massive shock and awe strike that ultimately failed to break the regime. In return, Iran showed its own power by shutting down the Strait of Hormuz and triggering a global economic crisis. And now, we're left with a diplomatic path forward that is incredibly narrow and full of risk.
Which leaves us with the billion-dollar question that everyone, from world leaders to regular people, is asking right now. With a new, hardline leader in Iran and a truce that's basically held together by the threat of mutual destruction, is this a real chance to de-escalate and find some kind of lasting peace? Or is this just a pause, a timeout for both sides to rearm and get ready for an even bigger, more destructive war? Right now, nobody knows the answer.